Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
This week, I wanted to kick us off by talking about an article that I wrote for The Telegraph over the weekend, which was basically looking at my own evolving views about Britain's relationship with Europe, which I wrote as somebody on the right and from a small c conservative perspective, but most of all as somebody who started out voting for Remain in 2016, but now has no desire to see us go back in to the European Union. A key part of the point I wanted to make in the article is that my transition from quote-unquote Remainer to Leaver came in three stages. Firstly, that once the vote had been tallied, the vote in which I was on the losing side, as a Conservative who grew up near Liverpool, not a particularly rare phenomenon for me, but nevertheless, for me it became hugely important that the vote was actually delivered. Because actually the question that was being answered at that time by all of us really as a political nation and by our political class was less should Britain be in or out of the European Union, but much more actually were we a country that respected the outcome of referendum results or not. And the second of those I actually think is a much more fundamental question than whether or not we happen to be in or out of the EU. I think it goes right to the heart of our integrity as a democratic nation. So that was stage one, really, of my transition from Remainer to Leaver. The second actually goes back to one of the reasons why I personally voted to stay in the first place, which is that as a small c Conservative, I've never really met a constitutional upheaval that I liked. One of the things that sends a shiver down my spine is the idea that we will make these radical, jolting constitutional changes, the consequences of which are relatively hard to predict and which have the potential to upend all of our politics. That was what I always feared that the process of trying to implement Brexit would do. There were times when it seemed like it really might have done that. There were certainly moments in that process, for example, where the very future of the Conservative Party as one of the major parties in this country was at risk. Those European elections in 2019, where the Conservative Party came fifth on less than 10% of the national vote. There were moments in that process where the status of our Parliament as a, let's not overdo it, but a relatively respected centrepiece of British political life was being deeply undermined, as there were protests of people saying that the second referendum attempt going on in Parliament was an attempt to undo democratic votes and so on. So there was a huge amount in that process, which for me put at risk things about our constitutional settlement in this country that I like and admire, which I didn't beforehand think was really worth risking. And during the process, I thought was horrible and pretty traumatic for the country. And what that basically meant is that from a 2016 mindset, constitutional inertia, which shouldn't dominate your thinking, but it does play a role in mine. Constitutional inertia basically said, well, actually staying put is the safer option. But from the perspective of being out, as we are now after all that tortuous process, actually the inertia suggests otherwise, that we should in fact stay out, because what trying to go back in would risk doing would be to create all of that chaos again. And the third point that I made in this article is that Britain's status within the European Union prior to Brexit was relatively advantageous, i.e. we had better terms than lots of other nations who were in the EU. Some of the examples of that is that we were not obliged to be in the Schengen zone, for example, nor were we obliged to sign up to eventually joining the euro. These were opt-outs that were achieved in the 1990s. And that were the question to be put again, it would fundamentally be a different question to the one that the country faced in 2016. It would not now be a question of remain or leave, but it would be a question of stay out or rejoin. And to rejoin would not only mean repeating that chaos of recent years, it would almost certainly mean having to rejoin on worse terms than those that we had when we were actually in the European Union previously. I would find it quite difficult to imagine that the European Union of today would say to Britain, well, yes, we know you had Brexit, we know that you left, and actually you can rejoin on the same advantageous terms, as if there's no penalty for having left. Because one thing we actually do know about what the EU has done in recent years is they were, for internally coherent and logical reasons from their own perspective, they were quite keen to show that Brexit came with a penalty. And I think they would similarly be keen to show that rejoining after an act like leaving the EU came with disadvantages. You will rejoin on worse terms. So those three reasons really are what has convinced me that staying out of the EU is really the right thing to do. And we would actually be much better off focusing on the myriad things which we can control as a country, of little relevance to whether or not we're in or out of the EU or the customs union or the single market or whatever, which are actually much more important to determining the future economic, political, and social health of this country.
Lee, I say unto you, that likewise joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than over 99 just persons which need no repentance. Now, I thought it was a very good piece, Lee. I mean, obviously, it sees you moving from a position that I didn't take to one that I did take, but I thought that you set out your reasons very well. This is probably not the episode to relitigate Brexit. We may do a little bit of that when we do an episode a little bit later on this year on the 10th anniversary of the referendum. We didn't know each other at the time of the referendum. Of course, you were a Conservative Remainer and I was a Labour Leaver. And I have never regretted my vote for Leave, although it has caused at various points some friction with fellow comrades on the left who took a different view, although I would remind them that 1 in 3 people in Britain who voted for Ed Miliband in 2015 then voted to leave the European Union the following year. So it wasn't really that crankish a position to take. And as I think I've made clear on this podcast, I believe that skepticism about a supranational project which limits the ability of the British government to plan the economy in a socialist direction is the mainstream, historic, and I think probably proper rationale for the Labour Party to take. But nonetheless, that's probably a conversation for a different time. And so we probably won't go over why we were on the Leave Remain side in the 2016 referendum beyond those points that we've just made, but we may articulate that a bit later on in the year. But I think the points that you made about how the situation changed after the referendum are really important. One of the things that was most, I would say, traumatic, and I use that word deliberately, after the referendum result, was seeing the British political class, particularly in the Labour Party, take what I viewed to be a fundamentally anti-democratic position. Having voted for the referendum to take place in the first place, having backed up the position of the Cameron government, which was to say that whatever the people voted for, it would be implemented, and every single household in the country got a government publication that said that how you vote will be what the government does, regardless of the position of the government, and Labour as the opposition party backed that up at the time. Having put into Labour's subsequent manifesto the following year in the 2017 general election, that Labour would take us out of the European Union, take us out of the single market, and take us out of the customs union. That for the Labour Party in that period of, it was basically 2018 and 2019, to then repudiate all of that without any particular mandate, and then to declare that the Labour Party would refuse, in effect, to implement the Leave vote, was an astonishing betrayal. I use those terms, they're dramatic terms, but I believe those are the correct terms. And I really have a great deal of respect for people who voted Remain, like yourself, Lee, who could see that as well. And I have many friends who voted Remain, who took that position and saw that the second referendum position the Labour Party took was a fundamentally unjust one. It's one thing to have a second referendum after you implement the first, but you don't have a referendum to overturn the vote that people have already made before you implement it. Of course, we always have elections, and elections can overturn the results of previous elections, but you have to implement the previous election result first. You don't say, oh, I didn't like the result of that general election. Before we seat any of the MPs who've just been elected, let's do it again. That's basically what the position was that Labour took with the second referendum. Of course, the Liberal Democrats were the worst on this from the very start. And it's one of the reasons why I have never taken to Keir Starmer. I think I never will take to Keir Starmer, because he was the ringleader of this as the shadow Brexit secretary in 2018 and 2019 and pushed against the instincts of Jeremy Corbyn, who as Labour leader didn't want a second referendum. It's quite clear that he didn't. And Starmer has never, ever apologised for his role in that. And I think that explains a huge amount of the breach of trust, fundamental trust that Labour has had with its historic constituencies that were the working class, leave-inclined constituencies and where the party is today. So that's all to say, absolutely see that reason that you took immediately after the referendum and then in that 2018-19 period to say, look, it's really important in terms of British democracy to implement this result, even if it's not the result that I voted for or wanted. And then I think you're also correctly to say that once we did leave in 2020, that the prospects of rejoining are rather different than if we had never left to begin with. Now, in my view, the opt-outs that Britain had achieved with respect to, say, the single currency were not, in my view, enough to justify membership to begin with, but I certainly think that they elevate the case against rejoining. And I think that your instinct is probably correct that when the British public are faced with the reality of what membership would mean, that we are not returning to what the EU was in 2016. We're not returning to what our membership was in 2016. We're joining a project which has much more aggressively integrated, and we would be required to much more aggressively integrate ourselves into it, that I think the British public would ultimately vote against a rejoin prospect. I know people say, look at the polls, and it looks like there is a majority for a rejoin in some polls and so on. I'm going to be doing some polling myself with an organization that I'm involved in, where we're going to look into actually, if we put to the British public some of those realities, whether they would see those trade-offs as worth it. And I think they probably would not.
A few things that I wanted to comment on. I was interested in how you said that a third of the people who voted for Labour under Ed Miliband in 2015 then went on to vote Leave. That's probably a hugely important block of people in our politics still. Of course, they are then the people who, not universally, but to some degree, vote Conservative in 2019 to try and deliver that vote and help deliver places like the Red Wall, much discussed in recent years, for the Conservatives under Boris Johnson. That group probably also has a significant crossover with some of the voters now that Keir Starmer's Labour Party, particularly when Morgan McSweeney was in number 10, and we'll see how it plays out afterwards, are most concerned about having lost or the prospect of losing, because that probably represents a significant chunk of the people who were historic Labour voters who are now thinking of or actively supporting Reform UK. So I suspect that very block is hugely important, and the way in which Labour has treated them in the years since, or been perceived to treat them and their wishes, is probably a really big factor in our politics. It speaks in part to the way in which the multiple ways in which Brexit has confused our politics. One of the examples I remember talking about back in 2024 during the Conservative leadership election to replace Rishi Sunak is how you had somebody like James Cleverly, who was a Leaver and who had supported Liz Truss, who was cast as being some sort of wet centrist in the leadership contest, particularly by his critics, which did not seem to reflect his recent record very accurately. And then you had somebody like Robert Jenrick, who was a Remainer, who had supported Sunak, who was cast as some figure of the right, the hard right even, pick your variation of defining the right, but certainly to the right of the Conservative Party. And of course, now he's with Reform UK, stood side by side with the man who was so Brexity Nigel Farage, that the official Brexit campaign basically wanted to keep him at a distance because they thought he might actually undermine their prospects in 2016. So you get this remarkable churn, not just to the party's voter coalitions, but also actually to the people within the parties and how they are perceived and how they project themselves, that I think you can see as being one of the consequences of Brexit. And at least in part with people on the right, some people being very keen to play down what their views once were. On this idea of if there were now a second referendum and the expectation that it would reverse the outcome of the first, I'm personally very skeptical of that as well. It's undeniable that there is this regret phenomenon, that a lot of people who are in the UK at the moment do think that Brexit has not gone well. You can see that very clearly in the polling data, do not think it was worth it, and do not think we have made the most of it. I think those points are actually fairly uncontroversial. Even people like Nigel Farage will say that he thinks Brexit has not gone well, and he will use that as not a reason for saying it never should have happened, but for saying that somebody else, probably him, should have been in charge of doing it. But I think that is, for the reasons that we've discussed, a very different question to actually what would be on the ballot in any new referendum, because it ignores just how different that question is for the reasons we've discussed. It ignores people who've been on basically the journey that I have and would rather see that question put to bed so that we can focus on, in many ways, more important questions about Britain and its future and the way it is governed that really got neglected in that period of 2016 to 2019 in particular. And then, of course, the pandemic poses its own challenge. There's a huge number of things. You can see this in issues like welfare claimants, size of the civil service, lots of things which now we look at with eyebrows raised and say, gosh, something really went wrong in our politics around them. And I actually think what big part of what it is that the entire British state took its eye off the ball of governing the nation in these years because it was trying to deliver Brexit. And part of the reason why I would never want to go through the process of joining again is that I wouldn't want the same thing to happen. It would absorb so much of this dreadful term people use, bandwidth of our political class, that so many other things which actually really fundamentally matter would be overlooked. And one of the final bits of evidence that I have that it is not actually a particularly compelling message is that if we take the 2019 Liberal Democrat campaign, they did what I think is in many ways quite a reasonable thing for them to do as a small party in that deeply divisive period going into a general election that is really about one question, Brexit, yes or no. They firmly planted their flag in the no camp and basically said, we won't do it. No, not even another referendum. We just won't do it. And as a message, it bombed. The most famous example of that is, of course, Jo Swinson losing her own seat up in Scotland. But generally speaking, I think what the Lib Dem experience was at that time is that their membership went up very significantly. In 2019, their membership was roughly twice what it is today. So there were a relatively small number of people who were very motivated by that Lib Dem message of stop Brexit from ever happening. But that didn't translate into votes because it wasn't a message with mainstream appeal. And fundamentally, when you're talking about issues like this, and certainly issues where it's a binary question, yes or no, you have to have a pitch which has broad mainstream appeal. And I am still not of the view that rejoining would, even though I do not doubt for a moment that the regret phenomenon of people regretting the fact that we left is very true in lots of cases.
I think you make a couple of good points I just want to pick up on. So the first is on the Lib Dems. I wouldn't even look at 2019, I look at 2017. The Lib Dems were the only party that was making a big deal about a second referendum in the 2017 election. We have to remember in 2017, there was no real discussion from Labour that Labour would not implement the Leave result. It was in the manifesto, it was party policy. You had Diane Abbott as Shadow Home Secretary talking about how freedom of movement was coming to an end. Labour was going to take us out. We couldn't be in the single market because we needed to end freedom of movement. This is Diane Abbott saying this as Jeremy Corbyn's Home Secretary. 2 years later, you've got Keir Starmer, Shadow Brexit Secretary, saying we need to make the case for EU free movement, which in my view was clearly designed by Keir Starmer to sink the Labour vote in that 2019 election for cynical reasons. In 2017, when Labour was making the Leave argument, its vote went up 10 points from the 2015 election. The majority of the seats that Labour won in the 2017 election were Leave voting Conservative seats. The Lib Dem vote in that election, if you wanted to say, I'm not happy with Labour and Tories both being pro-Brexit, the Lib Dem option was a disaster. The Lib Dem vote went down in 2017 after the Brexit referendum compared to 2015. And that's compared to 2015, when the Lib Dems was so toxic as a result of having been in government for 5 years with the Tories. So it was clear to me that this second referendum position was politically not a goer, but also fundamentally was undemocratic. Have a second referendum after you've left. Fine. Okay, it's a position you can take, I think, legitimately within our democracy. But what the second referendum position did was it basically confirmed the cynicism of people who already had very low trust in our political class, who thought the political class looked down on them, thought they knew better, and then basically confirmed that view as, I think, basically correct. And in the way that I've heard Remain people talk about Leavers is terrible. And it has fueled this kind of anti-establishment view in the electorate. I mean, I can remember when I was at Oxford at the time of the 2016 referendum, and I can remember distinguished Oxford academics say to me that I was the only intelligent person he knew was thinking of voting Leave. It's a bit of a backhanded compliment, I have to say. I met many people in Oxford who said they didn't know anyone else other than me who was voting Leave, which was also a huge problem. On the Brexit point, I think the fundamental issue there is that it's not that we've seen a massive conversion of Leavers to the cause of the EU. But what I think we have seen is that, unfortunately, their cynicism about our political class and the ability of British politicians to govern us in a democratically responsive way is at rock bottom. If you are someone who lived in a historic fishing community, let's say you lived in Grimsby or Hull or Fleetwood, and you voted Leave, as many of those voters did in those constituencies, and now you know that being out of the EU has not seen Britain regain control of its fishing waters. Keir Starmer, as part of his EU reset, has agreed to extend EU control over 3/4 of our fishing stock until 2038 for basically nothing. I mean, I think it's absolutely an extraordinary betrayal of the Brexit vote for what Keir Starmer has done with respect to our fishing stocks. Why would you say that you think Brexit's gone well? Why would you say, oh yeah, it was the right thing to do because we voted to leave the EU and we've let them control our fishing stock still until possibly I'm dead? You know, I mean, it's not a surprise that people feel that way. My view is we have to put democratic pressure on our politicians to change course. And to be honest, that's what a lot of people are doing by looking at alternatives like reform. I'm not planning to vote reform. I'm a Labour Party member. I'm trying to put my influence on the Labour Party to wake up before it's too late, as they're driving this car at 100 miles an hour into a brick wall that's going to destroy the party. But that's the situation that we're in. And so I think that what I have seen, and of course we all have our own little bubbles, but what I have seen as someone who has a friendship group that spans Remain and Leavers and is skewed more to the left, although I have some friends on the right, is more cynicism about going back in than enthusiasm from the people who voted Remain, than interest in going back in from people I know who voted Leave.
Richard, what's your matter of interest this week?
So my matter of interest this week comes from an article written by Tally Fraser called Have Cameras Ruined the Commons? And in this piece, Tally writes about how she thinks televising parliamentary debates has contributed to a decline in the quality of MPs' speeches and the general discourse in the House of Commons. And basically, her position there is that MPs now make speeches so that they can then clip the video of their speech and put it up on social media. And they're not actually interested in the back and forth of parliamentary debate. They're not actually interested in developing deep arguments, but are just looking for sound bites and clips. I'm sympathetic to the gist of that argument. I think the issue is not necessarily televising Parliament. The issue is social media with televised Parliament. So I don't think this was really an issue from when Parliament, or I should say the House of Commons, first started being televised in 1990, because in those days it was really difficult for MPs to clip their speech and make some personal use of it. There were, of course, television programs that might clip speeches in Parliament, but MPs themselves did not have as much control over that, really didn't have any control over that at all. So there probably was a bit of playing to the gallery, and that was certainly one of the concerns going back to the 1960s when the Wilson government first experimented with the idea of televising Parliament. And there's some funny cartoons of parliamentarians dolled up and wearing their sunglasses and for their moments in lights and so on. And so there's probably a little bit of that. But I don't think the problem really has emerged in the way that Tally has described until very recently, when MPs used their speeches for X and Facebook and TikTok and Blue Sky and YouTube. But I do think she's onto something there. I do think she's onto something. She makes a point in her piece about how MPs will sometimes ask questions in the Commons, clip the question, put it on their social media, never put the answer, to ministers, which is a sort of, what's the point of asking the question if you don't put the answer for your constituents to see? But the point really is it's a kind of virtue signaling thing to your constituents. I asked about this. Don't I care so much about our community? Who cares about what the actual answer is? And that's a real problem. I think that poorly serves constituents as well. So what can be done about it? Well, Tally suggests that we shut off the cameras in the Commons and go to audio recording. She points to a study, which I must say I haven't read myself, about the Parliament of Turkey, where in Turkey some sessions are televised and some aren't. And the study shows that MPs do behave differently when cameras are on and cameras are off. That makes sense. So maybe one possibility is you televise some of the parliamentary debates and you don't televise others. Interesting idea. Maybe you televise PMQs and statements from the Prime Minister, but maybe you don't televise as a default most other parliamentary debates. I don't know how you decide that, how you work that out. The House of Commons, before it was televised, was simply recorded audio from the 1970s. And my experience of that, beyond the historic clips of listening to the audio, is that in the United States today, the Supreme Court's oral arguments are not video recorded, but are only recorded by audio. I listen to those audio recordings. I find oral argument in the Supreme Court really quite interesting as someone who teaches US politics and teaches about the US Constitution and the law and public law in the United States. And I do think that there is something about the seriousness and the back and forth in those Supreme Court recordings, which might be lost if they were televised, not so much necessarily from the justices, although that might be part of it, but actually from the lawyers in trying to gain the attention of interest groups and the public beyond the court. Whereas at the moment, I think it does maintain focus on the argument. So I think where I am at the moment is I'd like to do a bit more research on this, but I could see the case for some kind of hybrid solution here where you televise some of the major debates in Parliament, but you switch off the cameras as a default and you go back to audio recording.
If the question is, why is the standard of our parliamentary debates deteriorating? Open question as to whether or not they are. But if that's the implicit assumption of the question, I think pointing the finger at the televising of Parliament is making allegations at the wrong culprit. I think actually lots of other things have gone on instead, which make, as this piece on Conservative Home argues, parliamentary contributions much shorter. And I also don't think it's the emergence of Twitter videos as well that necessarily does it. Some of the things that I think actually matter much more. One of them is that in 1988, so that's actually really just before television cameras come in, there was a new Standing Order 47, which allowed the Speaker to impose time limits on backbench speeches. So I think we cannot say that speeches have got shorter without factoring in that Parliament's own rules have changed, which have often enabled the Speaker to limit backbench speeches. Another change that's happened a great deal since then as well is quite often the format of the parliamentary day has changed. I mean, what do I mean by that? That recent speakers have been much more willing to grant urgent questions than they have been in the past. So that might be where something dramatic happens, let us say the arrest of a former ambassador to the United States. And the Speaker may say, well, actually, that is of such significant public interest that we will allow an urgent question at the request of an opposition party or maybe somebody else in order to make sure that that can be discussed the next day in Parliament. Now, of course, that is not a format in which MPs make speeches in a debate. It is a format in which they ask questions of a minister. So they are necessarily shorter than if they were making longer speeches. There are arguably some other changes about the length of sitting days as well, but I think that doesn't really matter too much. There's some evidence I've seen that the length of sitting days has declined by about an hour or so since 1979, but I think that's probably not a big factor in this. What I think is a factor is that members of Parliament are now much keener to speak. So one of the things that we've seen is that MPs may be making shorter contributions in the House of Commons, but they're making them much more often. So the Hansard Society very usefully put together some information on this in 2024, which showed that in the 1980s, about 1 in 3 MPs would stand up in the chamber on a sitting day and make some sort of contribution. Most often that would just be asking a question. By 2019, admittedly, in a very febrile Brexity atmosphere, as we were discussing earlier in the podcast, that was up to 2 in 3. Now, it's perfectly possible that televising proceedings and social media clips is one of the factors in MPs wanting to speak more in the chamber, and therefore, due to the limits on the parliamentary day, speaking more but for less time. But it's not obvious to me that that is necessarily a bad thing. If people make relatively short but incisive contributions or ask penetrating questions of ministers, it's not obvious that that is a worse thing to do than somebody making a 10 or 15-minute speech as a backbencher. Just the final thing I want to say, and obviously keen for you to come back in, Richard, is the assumption of the piece is, and there's almost certainly evidence for this, is that the public want short, snappy content in terms of how they digest their politics. And I don't necessarily doubt that that is true to some degree. But there's actually a lot of evidence that that's not just what the public wants. So, we've spoken in the past about how things like podcasting and long form forms of entertainment, if we're correct to call this entertainment, maybe not all listeners would agree.
Torture.
It actually has a bit of a surge in popularity. You see the same with YouTube videos and sort of documentaries actually get very long a lot of the time. They're not just always short and snappy in the way that Instagram reels are. And if I think of the parliamentary speech that I saw maybe get the most traction online within the last year, it was a July 2025 speech by Danny Kruger prior to his defection to Reform UK about the importance of Christianity to him and in this country. And that got 3.9 million impressions online, and it was a 10-minute speech. So I don't necessarily buy the idea that it's only the short, snappy stuff that members of the public are interested in. But of course, that does not rule out the fact that that is what MPs think they're interested in, and therefore that is what they try and share predominantly.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to hear from any MPs who listen to this podcast about whether they are frustrated with the quality of debates in the Commons or whether they actually think that the quality is pretty good. A point that Tally makes in this piece is she says, barely anyone is listening, the chamber is half empty, and those present are glued to their phones. Sometimes it looks like that when I watch Commons debates. One possible response to that is maybe ban the use of phones in the House of Commons. I don't know necessarily how that would go down, but maybe that would help MPs force them to be free a little bit by taking away a distraction. One thing I disagree with Tally in this piece, she cites Michael Gove, who apparently once said, think in ink. Think about how your speech should be presented on the written page. She said, by writing a speech down, it forces you to be logical, makes you assess exactly what you're about to say and the beliefs behind it. In essence, not directing yourself for a quick social media hit. I'm not sure I agree with that, because the thing that frustrates me actually about parliamentary debate is the sense that it's overly scripted. If MPs do write down their speeches and just sit there and read their speeches, then it does give me the sense that they probably haven't been listening to other MPs. And I don't know what's quite happened, but I think there used to be a convention that you wouldn't read a speech in the Commons. Certainly from the backbenchers, ministers might make a statement where they'd read the statement, but the debate itself should be more free-flowing. And certainly going through parliamentary archives, as I've done over the years, when I've looked at speeches that say Peter Shaw, I've looked through Peter Shaw's speeches, Peter Shaw being a Labour minister in the 60s and 70s who we've done a podcast on. He would just jot down sort of words that would be prompts for him to say what he wanted to say. I have to say, he had terrible handwriting, so sometimes I wonder how he even could understand the words that he'd written down. But he hadn't written out a speech. So I actually think that kind of scripting, which Tally praises, is actually not the direction to go. So maybe before going to the extreme of shutting down the cameras, I would consider banning the use of mobile phones in the Commons, and I would also request that the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker are more vigilant in deflecting MPs from reading speeches rather than simply having notes that they make occasional reference to.
Yes, it's a good question of actually what would we do? I mean, just to maybe finish with the idea of banning television. One of the reasons why I don't think that's particularly compelling is what it would ultimately do is it would reduce transparency around parliamentary proceedings. It would make it less likely that people engage with what was going on in Parliament if it became, say, an audio only format. And it would also arguably make it harder for people to really get a sense of what was really happening in the chamber and judge MPs accordingly. For example, if we take something which I don't have much sympathy with the criticism, but lots of people thought it was outrageous when Jacob Rees-Mogg was basically lounging on the Treasury bench when he was a minister. You would never have known that. Now, maybe that's not a problem. It probably isn't. But
Well, we would have known about it because parliamentary sketch writers would have been there. And Tally also says that she would have been open to keeping photographers at the Commons.
okay, well, maybe you would have known it, but that's probably not of great significance necessarily. But in terms of things that actually might improve debate, then I do have more sympathy with the idea of banning phones in the chamber. I would have sympathy with the idea that parliamentary days should be longer and the length of time given to scrutinise legislation should be longer, and therefore time limits on MPs' contributions should be used much more sparingly, so that even if more MPs do wish to speak, actually they get the chance to speak for slightly longer, should they so wish. Because I do think this point that you mentioned about how the debate goes is really very important. Because fundamentally, lots of what Parliament does is meant to be a debate. And debate does require a degree of fluidity. It requires responding to arguments. It requires trying to tune yourself in to the mood of the chamber and the people around you. Not necessarily so you can just agree with them, but so that you can actually appreciate the arguments from your perspective that are most likely to resonate with them, and hopefully even change their mind if that's what you set out to do. And I don't think you get that in a good or healthy way when MPs stand up with a fully typed out speech in front of them and almost bury their head in a piece of. The worst is when it's plain white A4 paper and it just looks ridiculous. I mean, if you're to insist on doing that, use A5 paper and use the cream kind of parliamentary paper. It just looks much smarter. Now, again, people might say that's a rather trivial criticism, but I actually think it's quite an important one, because if you try to create that norm that people wouldn't just read out their pre-prepared speeches, and that people don't have their phones so that they have to engage more in the debate of what's being said, then I think we would probably improve the quality of that. But the very final thing I certainly want to say on this is that part of what the piece that Tally has written focuses on is about how there are structural incentives in politics for MPs to make these short and clippable contributions. And that is true, except the structural incentives are much, much wider than that. And fundamentally, the structural incentives come down to what do we as voters want from our members of parliament? And therefore, what do they try and give us? In that sense, MPs clipping and sharing their speeches so that more of their electors may see them is not in and of itself a bad thing. And if it has adverse consequences, and that is part of a much wider set of structural incentives around members of parliament, some of which we've spoken about before, the enormous amount of time that casework takes up for MPs versus what legislative scrutiny takes up for MPs. There's a much wider set of problems around that. And again, I find it impossible to imagine, if I'm honest, that putting the toothpaste back in the tube of televising the Commons would make much of a difference, if any difference at all. That's all for this midweek Matters of Interest. I dare say that lots of listeners have views on some of the things that we've discussed, given that we've been on the thorny topics of Brexit and the nature of our Parliament. If you do, we'd be very glad to hear from you. Our emails are in the show notes. And also, if you're a member of our Patreon, there's a members chat in there where you're very welcome to post some thoughts and share them. And Richard and I will read all of those. On the Patreon, you can also listen to the podcast ad-free, and there are bonus episodes up there too. Also, if you enjoy listening to the podcast, we'd be really delighted if you left us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts from. That helps other people to find us and gives us at least a little confidence boost going into the day when we see that the number of reviews has trickled up. Well, as long as it's a nice review, obviously. Otherwise, we'll be back on Sunday with our next substantive episode and deep dive into another topic in Britain's post-war political history. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.